by Abir Al-Zubaydi.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Abir Zubaydi, and I'm a PhD researcher from Nottingham Trent University. In today's presentation, I'm going to present and explain my work, which is breast cancer diagnosis using a hybrid genetic algorithm for feature selections based on mutual information. The content of my presentation will be what's the breast cancer diagnosis, statistical method, predictive modeling, evolutionary computation, the hybrid approach, data set and result which has been used, current work, and conclusion. I'd like to start by looking at what's the breast cancer. Breast cancer begins in the breast tissue and may start in the duct or lobe when the controls in the breast cells are not working properly, so they divide continually and a lump or tumor is formed. Breast cancer is the most common cancer in women in both developed and developing countries. The number of breast cancer cases worldwide was estimated at 14.1 million new cases and 8.2 million deaths in 2012. We can see if untreated, the breast cancer can grow bigger, taking over more surrounding breast tissue. So the successful early detections and the earlier breast cancer is found can help and can bring better treatment to patients and can help medical experts to make important decisions about patients' healthcare. Now let's have a look at how is the breast cancer diagnosed. Statistical methods are the most popular approach used in clinical practice for cancer diagnosis and prognosis. However, it's a challenging task for statistical method alone to analyze and deal with this problem. The diversity and dimensionality of the data. We all know several methods used to detect cancer in patients, such as blood tests, X-ray, CT scan, and another patient examinations. Each test can hold important information about patient health care. So it is not easy task for statistical method to deal and process a huge number of data gathered from different sources, collected from image, from gene expression, from clinical data. In terms of the uncertainty and imprecision, which is typically found in clinical data, very important task for physicians remains making important decisions under the uncertainty and imprecision. Also, patient data set contains a lot of irrelevant and redundant features, and our task is to select the most important feature for cancer diagnosis. So, the recent interest has shifted towards the predictive modeling. Predictive modeling in medicines involves extracting a mathematical model for the prediction of an outcome for the future patients. In this work, our goal is to classify two types of tumor for breast cancer diagnosis. If the tumor is malignant or benign. Biological predictive modeling, generating a biological and a good biological predictive modeling is very, very huge challenge. We have to consider three criterions to construct a good model. The first thing, how we can fit the particular data sets and achieve high level of prediction accuracy. Stability, how we can the model be stable over the variation in the training sets, and how we can make the results be generalized to other datasets. Evolutionary computation, which is a rapidly growing area of artificial intelligence, work on a principle of natural selection, which is based on Darwin theory. Evolutionary algorithms are very suitable for constructing a good biological predictive modeling. The evolutionary algorithm used to find an optimal solution by searching a full space rather than partial space. Also, especially effective when the information is dynamic and certain, which is particularly appear in clinical data. The hybrid genetic approach. In this work, we propose method which is based on the combination of genetic algorithm and the mutual information for identifying the most important cancer predictors. Genetic algorithm iterate through the combination of features where the mutual information is used to guide the search process in genetic algorithm to select the most relevant feature for cancer diagnosis. The solutions are found by the proposed method are used to train two different classifiers, the support vector machine and the k-nearest neighbor. The prediction will be based on the knowledge which has been extracted and obtained during the learning process. The datasets. We use Wisconsin breast cancer datasets provided by University of Wisconsin Hospital in Madison. The dataset contains records collected from 699 patients. According to the class distribution, 458 benign cases and 241 malignant tumor cases. This is the description of Wisconsin breast cancer datasets. 9 features used to describe the feature, 9 attributes used to describe the feature, and the last one used to describe the diagnosis class. The experiments were conducted using leave one out cross-validation, which is the most acceptable approach in machine learning experiments on clinical data. Since Wisconsin breast cancer dataset has 699 patients, so 699 iterations. In each iteration, 699 minus 1 cases were used for training and 1 remaining case was used for testing. Experimental result using the support vector machine classifier. The result presented in this slide determine the true ability of the system to discriminate malignant tumor from benign tumor. This is how can the system discriminate between these type of tumor based on the knowledge which has been obtained during the learning process. The support vector machine classifier was creating using 4 kernel functions: radial basis functions, linear, quadratic, and multi-layer perception. We use 4 evaluation measures to evaluate the performance of the proposed method. We use correct rates, area under the curve, and false positive rates, true positive rates. We can see linear SVM achieve the highest level of area under the curve and correct rates using 7 features. However, the quadratic SVM achieve also very high level when using 5 features. Experimental results using the KNN classifier. Several KNN models were created using various distance measures. We use correlations, Minkowski, Euclidean, and Euclidean. The high level of area under the curve and correct rates achieved when using 9 features and 7 features. And from observing the performance of KNN classifier, we can see the Minkowski and Euclidean performs better consistency than correlation and Euclidean. In this work, we developed hybrid optimization approach for breast cancer diagnosis based on mutual information and genetic algorithm. The experiments were performed to evaluate the performance of the proposed method using 2 different machine learning algorithms, the KNN with various distance measure and the SVM with different kernel functions. The results reveal that the proposed hybrid approach is highly accurate for predicting breast cancer. So that brings me to the quote by famous statistician George Box. He said, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." Simply, your model is your assumption. And finding a good assumptions is very, very huge challenge. But moving from statistical method to more advanced technique, to evolutionary algorithm, to computational intelligence approach will help us a lot, will help to understand how different type of cancer grow and develop, will help to understand how our body works, so the prediction will be better. I'd like to say thank you so much for my supervisor, Dr. Georgina Kozma, and the supervisory team, Professor Graham Pockley from John Van Gees Cancer Research Center, and Professor David Brown, the head of Interactive System Research Group. I'd like to say thank you so much, and special thanks to my country, Iraq, Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research, for funding and supporting my study. Thank you so much.
Phew. That was a lot to do we have any questions? Penny?
Thank you very much for that presentation. I noticed you presented the results in terms of the number of features you used for each of the prediction. Did that method allow you to decide that some features maybe would never be any good in prediction and need to be collected?
In biomedical study, you know, the domain experts spend a considerable time and effort on a small subset of features. So we focus on finding a most important feature and validates our results. How we can validate we achieve the highest important and relevant feature for cancer diagnosis. So we are looking for both finding relevant features and predicting the breast cancer.
But that was just in terms of the number. Sorry, it's not my opinion.
In terms of the accuracy and area under the curve and false positive rates and true positive rates. So we use 4 evaluation methods. We use different evaluation methods to evaluate our results.
But in terms of those features, so obviously there was quite a powerful prediction for 7 features. But I think you originally had a list of 10.
But I have 699 patients.
But out of those 10, are there some features which are no good in prediction?
So you can
identify.
Okay.
So that in practice, then people may not need to collect that information.
Okay. Because we use genetic algorithm, so we have combination of feature, I can't say the feature number 10 is the most, number 9 is the most important. I can't say the feature number 3 is, for example, 375 is the most important feature. So yeah, there is a relevant feature and there is a irrelevant feature for cancer diagnosis.
Are there any more?
In terms of this, so you're modelling what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay. Where do you think this algorithm takes you next in terms of, actual studies and breast cancer work?
Sorry.
Having developed this algorithm to help you make predictions, what are you going to do with predictions next? Where does that go next?
I will give these predictions for the biomedical experts, so they can make a good clinical decision making for patient healthcare. We can follow many things. We can follow different goal in biomedical research. So this is the first goal, is to predict, and we are follow how the biomedical research asks us to predict. So if the biomedical expert asks what is the most important feature, so we will predict what is the most important feature and give them, and they will use these features in their research. So there's many goals to use this, but not by us, by the biomedicals. Yeah.
Can you please give us an example of one of the features and the complexity of it?
Sorry?
Could you please give us an example of one of the features you used, for example, out of 7, and the complexity of it, how many indexes is used?
How many features are used?
How many indexes of data do you use in the feature in one single feature, for example? You said you use GA to develop the features.
Yeah.
Could you give us an example of a single feature?
Sorry, I don't understand your question.
What does a single feature look like?
I'm not looking for single feature because I'm using evolutionary algorithm, and the evolutionary algorithm work with the combination of feature. And for another reason, since I work with the biomedical data, so the biological data always have interaction between feature, so I can't use just single feature, I have to use the combination of feature.
What would that combination look like in a single feature?
For example, I will say I have, for example, 9 feature. I will say the feature number 2, as example, 2, 5, and 7 is the most important feature. So I give you a combination of features.
Perhaps you could have a face-to-face discussion afterwards.
Yes,
Would that be helpful? I think, well, if anybody else has got any questions, perhaps you'll address them directly. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce now our next presenter, Eva Mertzin, who's going to talk about our virtual selves.
Hey. Hello everyone. This is a bit of an odd presentation in this particular context, but hopefully I'll be able to convince you that this topic is actually relevant to a lot of healthcare and education applications. So this was a project I did in teamwork with one of my MSc students, Evelyn Valgren, and we were both working at University of Glasgow. So there's a lot of research. There we go. There's a lot of research about video games out there. Now, a lot of it is focused on the negatives of video games, things like the effects of video games on aggression. So what makes us, whether playing video games makes us more aggressive, and that's a very, very well-researched subject with a lot of controversies and very little concrete evidence that games actually cause aggression. Now, more recently, cognitive enhancement has been gaining popularity as a theme in video games, so we started looking at the positives of video gaming. There's also research on social engagement in video games, on development of emotional intelligence and collaborative capabilities through video gaming. Now, what interests me in particular is how we can approach games not as these monolithic entities, everyone who engages with this particular game is going to have this exactly same experience, but rather how do people engage with games differently, and how do games that give us choices about what we do and how we do that, how do they affect people psychologically, and how do people with different features and characteristics engage with these games. So we're talking about choice in games. And there's a lot of choice inbuilt into pretty much every game genre. So if you think about strategy games, in Civilization you can play a peaceful civilization with 0 war units and basically conquer the world through science, technology and diplomacy. Or you can be a roving horde of military units who will just take the world. In Sims you can be a benevolent god, or you can put your Sims in the swimming pool and move the ladder and watch them drown. Obviously, there's some shooter games and storytelling games that allow you to achieve your goals through violent means, so doing things aggressively, or allow you to sneak through the game and achieve your objectives without killing a single non-player character. And finally, there's role-playing games, which are very immersive, and they give you a lot of choices about who you play, how you play, about both the means of achieving your goals, but also about your goals. Do you want to save the world, or do you want to destroy the world, or do you want to rule this? And this is not something that's been checked, or basically it's not been researched a lot. So how do and my particular focus is how players engage with moral choices in video games. And moral choices in games are very interesting because games contain a lot of scenarios where you have to choose whether you take one path or the other path, and they will have consequences in terms of both the gameplay mechanics but also of storytelling. How do you choose who gets to live or who gets to die? And I was particularly interested in a game that I'm a huge fan of, which is the Mass Effect series. It's a very nice game to look at moral choices, largely because it presents some very subtle dilemmas. A lot of games, when they try to give you the option to be good or bad, the good options are sort of very nice, pro-social and collaborative, but the bad options tend to limit to petty, meaningless violence, you being bad just because you can, rather than having any particular goals in doing so. Mass Effect gives players a very fixed goal. They're saving the world, but they can do this through two sort of pathways. One of them, the blue one, is the Paragon pathway, which has them be cooperative, collaborative, avoid violent interactions whenever possible, and generally can be in a way described as a deontological pathway. So deontological rules in morality are the ones that don't look at the consequences of actions, but things are done or not done because it's just wrong to do so. So you shall not kill is one deontological rule. And the other pathway, the red one, is the renegade pathway, very nicely named, where you essentially you think that the goal justifies the means. You will be more violent, more aggressive, more confrontational, you can betray some people for the same good goal, but the gameplay experience is much more rough and much more violent. So I wanted to find out whether there's any differences in between players who choose the Paragon and Renegade pathways in the game, in terms of both their personality and their real-life moral sort of alignment, so to say. So we managed to recruit over 1,000 Mass Effect players through an online survey. And I will say that to anyone who does video game research, if you know your target population well, you can get hundreds and thousands of participants very easily. It was a slightly different sample to your typical Mass Effect players. We had more women than men, largely because we recruited through social media sites, so BioWare forums and Tumblr. So basically the user profile was heavily skewed towards females. We gave them the Big 5 personality inventory, so 44 questions asking about their personality features. We asked them about their gameplay experiences, and also gave them the trolley scenarios, which I'll come back to when I actually discuss those results. So first of all, a couple of fast things about sort of just generally how do players choose in the game and their given choices. Mass Effect gives you the option to play either as a male or female protagonist. You can see from here that men were sort of almost evenly split on playing male or female characters, but the vast majority of women, over 90%, chose to play a female character. And to an extent, this might be a result of the fact that very few games give people a meaningful choice about playing male or female character, and in Mass Effect, the female character is very, very well created and fleshed out, so probably an attractive target for women who play video games. But interestingly, there were no gender differences in who picked being good or bad. So vast majority of players, you can see from here, over 70% chose to be good in their main playthrough. So when they were playing the game, they didn't even consider going Renegade. And there were no gender differences there, so men and women equally likely to play Paragon or Renegade. Now, when I looked at character gender and playstyle, that was a slightly different story, because it looked like male protagonists were much more likely to be played as Renegade than female protagonists. Now again, we saw that there's gender differences in which protagonist is picked by which gender, and we saw that there's no differences in the rate of being good or bad between player genders. So in order to find out what was happening there, I broke down the sample onto male and female players. And you can see from these graphs that for male players, there's no effect there. They're just as likely to be Paragon or Renegade with male or female characters. There's pretty much no effect there. But the female players, if they want to play the bad guy, they're more likely to choose a male character. And at this point, I have no answers as to why that might be. There's a couple of options. It may be that playing the bad option might be emotionally uncomfortable, because you do things you wouldn't do normally in real life. So it might be a way of distancing yourself a bit from the unpleasant emotions evoked by that particular pathway. It might also be due to the fact that because the Renegade pathway is anyway stereotypically coded as male, it seeks violence, it's very sort of dominant and aggressive. So it may be that they've chosen basically the male character to fit in with that stereotype. But more research is needed, ideally qualitative research, to actually ask about their perceptions. So yeah, that was just a tiny bit about the gender choices. Now the personality choices, and I'll probably skip through these quite quickly. The Big Five personality inventory is currently the standard way in psychology of looking at people's characteristics. It says most of personality can be described in terms of these 5 factors: extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness. So we looked at the levels of these traits for Paragon and Renegade players. What we found is that there are pretty much no differences in everything except for agreeableness, where high agreeableness means being cooperative, kind, and affectionate, and low agreeableness means a tendency to be uncooperative, antagonistic, and suspicious, which, considering what I said about how these 2 pathways play in the game, it matches our expectations very well. And this is a scatter and violin plot with the distributions of the different trait levels among the Paragon, Renegade, and mixed players, because there was a percentage of players who didn't stick to a particular pathway. So you can see the different distributions, and you can see that Paragon players were more agreeable than Renegade players. So people who in-game choose to be good and nice, their out-of-game personality characteristics also match that profile. They're a bit nicer to other people. They're more likely to cooperate and collaborate in real life. So there's 2 of these were statistically significant. So the differences between Paragon and Renegade and between mixed players and Renegade players were statistically significant. And actually the effect sizes were medium to large. So this is not a small effect, this is actually a fairly substantial effect in terms of personality. One interesting point here, sort of a consequence of this, personality traits tend to be very fixed. Some of them might be changed, but it takes a lot of time and effort to do so. And this is a very, very tiny piece of evidence for the fact that people who choose to play violent games or choose to play them violently are at the outset different to the people who engage in non-violent games. So it's more argument for choice effects in games rather than for games making us less agreeable or more violent. So now the trolley tasks. Actually, I'll first talk about this. So the trolley tasks are psychology's and philosophy's default way of looking at moral dilemmas. And there's 2 trolley tasks. The first one puts you in an imaginary situation where you are a supervisor of a track that carries trolleys to and from the city. And you notice that there's an out-of-control trolley that's hurtling towards a track where there's 5 workers in a ditch. And there's no way to stop that trolley. You can only redirect it. If the trolley goes onto the track, it will kill those 5 workers. You can redirect it by pulling a lever onto another track. There's 1 worker on that track, and that worker will not get away in time. So the question is, do you pull the lever? This might seem like a fairly fairly abstract scenario that doesn't have much to do with real life, I would argue that now that we have more and more self-driving cars, there's a lot of reasons for us to engage with trolley dilemmas, because at some point we'll have to figure out, do we program our self-driving car to kill the driver if the only choices it has is plow into pedestrians or plow into the wall? So these sort of started in the 1970s as abstract philosophical dilemmas. Now they're probably programmer dilemmas and ethical dilemmas we all have to engage in. So anyway, trolley scenarios. So in the first scenario, when we asked our video game players about do they push the lever or not, do they sacrifice one life to save 5, over 90% of all 3 game moralities, so the Paragon players, the mixed players and Renegade players, most of them said that yes, this is exactly what they would do, and there's no significant differences between these groups when you sort of look at chi-square. So all of our players were fairly utilitarian in their choice. They decided to sacrifice life and save 5. Now the second trolley task scenario and dilemma is a bit different. So you're still the trolley track supervisor, but you're inspecting the track from a footbridge. And you see the trolley hurtling towards 5 workers on the track. There's no lever this time. The only way to stop the trolley is to push something heavy onto the track. But next to you on the bridge, there is another railway worker with a very heavy backpack. You have just enough time to push them onto the bridge. You can't jump yourself, you're too light. Only that worker with a heavy backpack will be sufficient to stop the trolley in time. Do you do that? And most people, despite the fact that the maths is exactly the same, it's still 1 life for 5, are very reluctant to make that decision, because it basically comes into conflict with a lot of our intuitions about what's moral or not. There's no distance, there's the use of force. It directly basically comes into conflict with the "you shall not kill" principle. And in most cases, when you ask this question to general population, very few people would be willing to do that. Very few people say that this is right, this is moral, or they would do that. Now, our trolley are basically game players. You can see that Paragon players followed the usual population trends. 30% of them only 30% would push the person onto the tracks. Now, Renegade, 50%. So they were showing a much more utilitarian response rather than deontological response in this scenario. That instead of sort of starting to look and think at, is it right to take a life? It's too stressful, it's too uncomfortable. They were still following the sort of the utilitarian calculation of it's better to kill 1 than cause the death of 5. And 50% acceptance of this dilemma is actually very, very high. You don't see that very often. Now, I'll sort of, the one case you do see that is if people take this dilemma in second language, not in the primary language, because talking and thinking in your second language reduces the emotional loading of these dilemmas. Unfortunately, I was not aware of that effect when I was doing this study. I'm not aware of any particular relationships between player style and language. It's always a possibility. So these were the 2 major components of the study, the personality and the trolley task dilemmas. So what can we tell from them? Well, the participants' in-game alignment was related to their personality traits, so something that's actually fairly fixed, and there is good reasons to believe that personality has a strong biological component. But also the alignment was matching, to an extent, their trolley task decisions. And this is considering that the choices of in-game alignment are subject to many other mechanistic, basically, pressures than just your choices in the trolley scenario. There's particular ways in which the game mechanic rewards or doesn't reward your moral choices in-game. For example, in Mass Effect, you were encouraged to stick to one particular path, which is why most people were playing either Paragon or Renegade, and only a very small minority decided to sort of mix and match between the 2 decision options. And the important thing about that is that games present us with these scenarios, ready-made scenarios for moral reasoning. They're already complex and emotionally engaging. Now, the trolley scenario raises a couple of hairs, and I could see sort of people really thinking it through. But it still is a very isolated scenario where you don't know the people involved, and it's sort of more of a thinking game. Now, in a video game, the people involved in your moral choices might be the people you've been, non-player characters, game constructs, that you've been working with for days or hours of your life. They might be virtual pixels that you feel very attached to. which adds more of a realistic sheen to these scenarios and allows other rules to sort of come into play. Now, they're very challenging to use in an experimental paradigm because exactly the very thing that makes games such fascinating and deep environments means that it's very hard to sort of compress them into the 1 hour you need to spend in a lab. So there's still a bit of issues there about how to apply this for lab studies, but there's still potential for qualitative and survey research there. Now, the main limitations here is that I only looked at one facet of ethical choices. The rule sticking ones, so the ontological choices versus the maximizing utilitarian choices. But that's not it. There's also the types of principles people adhere to. So deontological choices, sticking to the rules might be the rules of non-violence, or there might be a rule of honor, or justice, or fairness. So there's a lot of rules, social cohesion that people can stick to. So none of that actually even touched upon that. And also Mass Effect, like as I said, I chose it because it's a very particular game with a very well thought out decision system. But there's other games that give you broader choices, or where even the ethical choices are nowhere near as clear. Witcher 3 is a very good example where it gives you lots of ethical choices, but the outcomes of those choices are never guaranteed, and you never know which is the good or a bad one. It's just different consequences for different populations. It's more principle-based rather than a simple rule-breaking versus utilitarian mindset. So thinking forward, there is a huge potential here to create games that encourage players to really reflect on various ethical dilemmas they encounter in real life. There's a market there in professional, medical, and business education, where people who come into these professions will be presented with ethical dilemmas. If someone's conducting malpractice, do they stick with social cohesion and not report them? Or do they do the hard thing and actually report them, risking their own reputation, their friend's reputation, risking social ostracism? So being able to play through these dilemmas and try to reflect about how your reactions would look like might help with keeping the ethical side of these professions. Civic education, similar dilemmas we might come across as citizens, as people who are engaged in the government, people who are engaged in our own societies. And also future challenges, and the keynote yesterday was absolutely brilliant because it brought to mind the fact that we will be living with robots, we will be living with artificial intelligence at some point. And being able to figure out how we feel about ethics of human enhancement, of ethics of depending on robots, on ethics of creating conscious artificial intelligence. There's a lot of books and movies that try to address that, but they never give us a choice. They just present the author's vision for how it is. But games actually allow people to practice that decision making. Mass Effect gives you two amazing non-player characters who are artificial. There's Legion and Edie, two characters with whom you start bonding, and at some point you need to make decisions. Do you choose the right to live? Basically, do you choose the artificial intelligence's right to live, or do you choose organic creatures' right to live? And it makes you think about what is it that makes us human? What is it that makes something a person, or something that feels or thinks? And I think that games for ethical reflection, there's already a couple of out there, and we can make a lot more, could have a really big role in making sure that our society, our civilization, don't lose track of actually what's important out there. So that's basically this.
I think we have time for a couple of questions. Do we have any questions?
I'm interested in the fact that your last slide there, you're talking about creating games for looking at ethical dilemmas. Because one of the groups I'm involved here, we're thinking about the city of the future and smart cities and what that would look like in Nottingham. And one thing is how do we engage citizens with that consultation? How do you get people to think about what are the options and what are the scenarios, and are there different ways we can engage with people? I just think creating some of these scenarios where you could actually model futures and options and things. What would the transport future look like? What would this look like? I think there's an interesting dimension here about how we create scenarios for engagement.
Yeah, and there's a lot of scenarios where you think, oh, this is a brilliant idea, It's only when you give it to people to sort of work through you realize that it has gaps. And using both VR and non-VR video games where you present people with particular transport improvement scenarios or anything else, that's when you start realizing, or they start picking up on both benefits and disadvantages of these plans. So I think there's definitely space for that as well. Mm-hmm.
Hey, that was a really great talk. Maybe I missed a detail during it. So when these gamers are presented with the trolley dilemma, they're presented with it in a conventional format as like a textual question. Okay.
Conventional format, yeah.
Right. So what happens if they do it in a game? Do you have any speculation?
There has been one paper that did a virtual reality trolley dilemma, and they expected to see more deontological responses because they thought that, especially for the bridge pushing scenario, because they thought that just the proximity to the virtual worker would make it more difficult. Counterintuitively, from what I remember, there were more utilitarian responses because the visualization of what's going to happen to the 5 workers on track was a very strong incentive for people to actually do the push. I think there was another paper that measured skin conductance and stress responses, so sort of showed that people do experience stress in these situations. But yes, I mean, there is the general question. When presenting things in virtual reality, especially in game contexts, games tend to really reward us being more utilitarian. Because in a variety of games, the goal of the game is not to be good, but is to achieve your objective. And you do whatever the game tells you to do in order to achieve it. So it sort of fosters utilitarian thinking. One of the major limitations of this study is that I first asked people about their in-game experiences and only then gave them trolley dilemmas, which means they might have sort of activated their game character thinking. They identified with their characters again, and then they made the trolley scenarios. So with one of my students this year, we're actually improving on the design and sort of doing a counterbalance design. So first asking about trolley scenarios and then game experience, and the group that's first game experience and then trolley scenarios to see if there's any sort of bleed through from thinking about their game performance to how they see themselves as moral agents.
We look forward to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So our final presentation of the conference is Bill Byron and Luke Sienna talking about enhancing the measurement of clinical outcomes using Microsoft Kinect.
Great, well thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's nice to be here. Well, I guess this is the last lecture, the last talk, right? So I hope we don't hold you up. I know there's lots of fun going on in the market square, so hopefully we'll all be ready to go to that in a minute. But Luke and I wanted to present some work that we've been reviewing together with Professor Breeden at Nottingham Trent, and also with a colleague of mine. Let's look at how this buzzer works. How does the pointer work? Is that the forward back button? No, it's not that, is it? So is it a pointer?
No.
Oh, there isn't a pointer.
No pointer.
I'm sure I saw someone with a pointer. Okay. And Willie Mulhausen, who works at ICON, that's the company that I work for. So I work in the pharmaceutical industry, and we're really interested in new and novel ways of collecting health outcomes data in clinical trials. So just a quick run through of what we're going to do this afternoon. A quick look at an overview of clinical trials. So just one slide really telling you about the drug development process and where this might fit in. And then Luke's going to talk about motion capture platforms in healthcare, and part of our paper is a review of all the possible technology solutions that are out there. Then I'm going to look at the literature and show some of the validation work that's been done using some of these platforms to measure health outcomes in clinical research. and then finally just show you a snapshot of a proof of concept system that we've been developing at ICON to do this. So just very quickly then, overview of clinical trials. If you were here last year, you'll have seen this same slide, right? So apologies for that. Thousands of compounds are discovered, and it takes thousands to actually just come up with about 5 that would then go into clinical testing, clinical trials. And clinical trials normally got 3 phases. The phase 1 is in healthy volunteers. These are small studies of 20 or 30 or 40 patients or subjects. And these studies usually are taking blood testing, so you're looking at what happens to the drug in the body, so how it's absorbed, how quickly it's absorbed, how quickly it's eliminated, and you're using that information to figure out what would be the best dose and the dosing regimen to take into patients. So phase 2 is the first time actually in patients, and phase 2 is larger studies, and this is looking at trying to optimise the dose and the regimen to get the best efficacy and the best safety profile for the drug. Then finally, these are the very large studies in phase 3. These are confirmatory studies, usually against placebo or an active comparator, where we're testing the drug in pretty large groups of patients, usually big global multinational studies. This whole process takes 10 years or so. It costs about $1.6 billion to develop a drug. So, it's an expensive process. And one of the reasons why we're interested in different ways of collecting outcomes data is that actually for many clinical trials we rely on subjective outcomes to actually measure treatment responses. So for example, a patient may go to the clinic and they may